instituted an open-door policy to increase foreign investment and a unification policy to integrate what had become two different Liberias, one westernized and the other not.
When we took office, there were those that came from the United States, considered themselves a separate class. Now nobody's afraid of each other. People from the Gribbos, the Crews, the Bassos, the Pellas, the Mandingos, the Lamos, and all of the people go freely and interchange.
That, I think, was a major psychological lift to enabling all Liberians in the political sense to see themselves as equal, operating in political jurisdictions that were of equal legal standing, equal political standing. I think that was something that created a basis to build upon.
The Royal Yacht Britannia arrives at Monrovia in the African Republic of Liberia with Queen Elizabeth, who is winding up her tour of African nations. Accompanied by the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, she is greeted by President and Mrs. Tubman.
Tubman was a consummate diplomat. He brought kings and queens to Liberia and traveled like an emperor abroad. It was hugely extravagant, but it placed Tubman and Liberia on the world stage. The country's upper class reveled in Western ways. The rest of Africa, no matter how poor, seemed to love it too. Not only could Africans be great politicians, but they could also do it with style and flair. But all this pomp and circumstance emphasized the gap between rich Monrovia and the poor hinterland. Tubman had a luxurious retreat with a farm and private zoo. His tastes combined the best of the West with the country diet of his youth.
He likes Westgate, black liver. His diet, his food he like is palm butter and rice, cigar. Sometimes he will smoke 4 or 5 cigars a day.
With his cigar and top hat, Tubman became a power broker in Africa. He was one of the founders of the Organization of African Unity. And at the same time, he was tightening the bonds with the U.S. Americans trained the Liberian army, and in the Kennedy years, the Peace Corps was everywhere. In a divided world, Tubman would come to master Cold War politics. He invited the U.S. to make Liberia a key staging post for America's fight against communism in Africa, and prospered accordingly.
They were always willing to give us facilities in Liberia. For example, we had unlimited use of Roberts Field, Roberts Port. We had 2 vast antenna stations there, one for diplomatic communications, one for Voice of America broadcasting, and we had an Omega navigation station there run by the Coast Guard. So it was a perfect relationship for us.
Tubman also used the Cold War as an excuse to increase his own power. He would gag the press and use ideology to quell opposition.
Don't you know that communism is infiltrating everywhere? And you will see that you will wait and see the house burning before you can provide means to extinguish it. Prevention is better than cure. That's what we're trying to do, prevent.
President Tubman of Liberia, a great leader of African First Republic.
We all grew up on this diet of, shall I say, Tubmanism, whatever that is, but the grand old man who ran the country and who organized a system that was rather personal in nature. And those of us who had gone to school, to university, during that period had wished perhaps for a slightly more open society.
But openness and democracy were not thriving in Liberia. Tubman celebrated the occasion when he changed the law to allow himself unlimited terms in office. His rule went from personal and paternal to authoritarian because, he said, people liked it that way.
Why doesn't the two-party system work in Liberia?
The two-party system does work in Liberia when the people are not satisfied. But when they're satisfied, they simply don't bother. The last two elections, I had no opposition. The first three elections, I had opposition. But there's nothing to prohibit it. The law is there, and I like an opposition. I tell them all the time, I like opposition, I want an opposition party, we'll encourage it. But we're not going to hand over the thing to you, you've got to fight for it.
Tubman's close friend and ally, David Coleman, did challenge Tubman. What happened next is hotly disputed. Tubman's supporters accused the popular Coleman of plotting to have Tubman killed with this gun. But Coleman's daughter believed that her father had been set up.
It was their plot, Tubman's plot, in order to arrest all the independent party people or kill them as they planned.
Coleman was pursued at the family farm.
My mother saw all the soldiers jumping out and just surrounding. They just started getting out of the cars and surrounding the house with guns pointed towards the house. And my mother, she went and lied down on the grass outside. And she said, "God, are you dumb?"
David Coleman and his son John were shot dead. Few dared attend their funeral. With Coleman's death, all formal opposition ended. All over Africa, the military was seizing power. A cautious Tubman turned his attention to his army. He was proud of it, but just in case, he kept it small so it couldn't pose a threat to him.
One of the most important thing in military soldier is obedience. His first duty is obedience. His second duty, obedience. His third duty, obedience. And everything is obedience.
Happy birthday to President Tubman.
Tubman required obedience from everyone. He created the ironically named PROs, or Public Relations Officers, whose sole function was to keep tabs on citizens and foreigners alike.
Tubman violated the rights of the people. With the PRO system, everybody got something, and they kept their mouth closed and they came to report. So he had his hands on the pulse of this country.
When Tubman died in 1971, the nation both wept and exhaled. His great but flawed presidency had come to an end. Tubman's to Liberia. She came to represent the United States at his inauguration on January 3rd, 1972. To Liberia. She came to represent the United States at his inauguration on January 3rd, 1972. Talbot proclaimed he wanted a government that was genuinely African. He wanted Liberia to be a force for African unity and civil rights.
We must ally ourselves against
against the common enemies of poverty and disease. And we march with the eternal cadenza of peace, of human upliftment, and of dignity at home and abroad.
He promoted Liberian culture, therefore he promoted African culture. See, so under him there was a movement to get away from this illusion that Liberians were Americans planted here in Africa.
In his quest for a more open society, Talbot loosened the reins of government control over people's lives, allowing a free press, debate, and dissent.
He dismantled, for instance, the PRO system, certain kind of apparatus, security apparatus, and the press became free. People could say what they want to say. He allowed political organizations, the university students, and so forth. So for the first 6-7 years, there was a lot of freedom.
Talbot began to tear down slums, replacing them with the first low-cost housing estates. He built roads and negotiated better deals with foreign companies, including Firestone. The American ambassador thought he was heavy-handed. He further alienated his American allies by welcoming the first Soviet, Chinese, and Cuban ambassadors to Liberia, realigning Liberia's position in the Cold War equation. At the United Nations, he spoke against U.S. positions.
We must equally insist on full recognition and respect for the national rights of the Palestinian people by the State of Israel, especially their right to self-determination and a state of their own. Israel must withdraw from all occupied Arab territories.
But his problems were at home. The economy stagnated, and the old guard of his party was resisting his political reforms. A fresh generation of student activists appeared on the scene and took full advantage of their newfound freedom to speak out.
Our philosophy will be what it's always been, to work towards the achievement of an equal and just society in Liberia, to work for a society based upon freedom, justice, and total equality.
I saw this as a society that had remained impervious to change. You had a society led by a political party which had been entrenched in power for more than 100 years. This country was like a tea kettle that was boiling. And if they're all practical people and they want to keep the society going, they will have to open it up, they will have to lift up the lid and allow the steam out.
Increasingly, Talbot became a tragic figure. His efforts to modernize the economy came up against the oil crisis of the 1970s. His bringing more indigenous people into government was resisted by party hardliners and ignored by his opponents. The general perception continued to be that the ruling elite consisted only of people of American settler ancestry.
Il y avait ce problème. Et le président Fauboigny, je me rappelle, disait au président Tolbert qu'il fallait faire attention aux natifs. L'un des problèmes que nous avons perçus à l'époque déjà, et pour lequel le président Fauboigny avait essayé, disons, de motiver le président Tolbert, c'était d'intégrer la native dans le développement économique, mais surtout dans les structures politiques.
Talbot was being accused of personal corruption and nepotism. When he received the keys to a new private jet, he joked that he needed it because he wanted progress fast. A daughter was Deputy Minister of Education, a son was Ambassador at Large, and a younger brother was Minister of Finance. Altogether, 23 of his relatives were in senior government positions. The economy was in disarray, and employment was rising. When Talbot proposed raising the price of imported rice, Liberia's staple food, expecting that local production would consequently increase, this was the last straw. Political dissidents took advantage of his proposal.
The president was one of the largest growers of rice in the country, and a price increase would have made him obviously a beneficiary. His brother was the largest importer of rice in the country. There were people who were close to the president who also had licenses. And at the time, you had to have a license to import rice, and licenses were given to specific people. Well, we posed a challenge to this increase, with salaries as they were, and we said that if the government would not rescind this decision, we would put people on the streets.
On April 14th, 1979, thousands of Liberians took to the streets. The demonstration turned into a riot. The police shot into the crowds, killing civilians. The organizers were arrested.
It was a radical turning point. For nearly 24 hours, this government was paralyzed, the Tubman government. He never expected this. We never expected it. It took everyone by shock that people could get on the street, destroy things. He was not really a politician. He was a minister and a good businessman. And he didn't have that control over the country as Tubman had.
The lower ranks of the army sympathized with the demonstrators. They quickly realized that Talbot's hold on the government was tenuous.
Many soldiers who were in the military at the time have talked about the president's appearance to them. You know, he addressed them on the morning of the rally. When they came from Todi and all of that, the president came down in the morning in his morning robe and his pajamas to talk to these soldiers before they were deployed. And his was an approach of an appeal. And it dawned on many young fellas that, you know, this question of the military being the bedrock of the authority of the state, and that they had some powers. The rank and file of the military began to feel his own power.
Not confident in his own soldiers, Talbot requested support from the President of Guinea, who sent in troops to calm the situation, infuriating the Liberian army. Now under intense pressure, Talbot was forced to release the organizers of the demonstration.
The organizers of that demonstration were granted amnesty and are now free, enjoying all the political and human rights of Liberian citizens, including the right to form and manage their own political organization and to use their headquarters for that purpose, with the express provision by government that they operate within the limits of the laws of Liberia.
But his authority was undermined. He appeared ineffectual and weak. By now, he had lost support in the army, he had lost the support of his party, and he had lost support in the streets. In the capital, there was talk of rebellion.
One could sense that unless we could break some impasse, you know, there were violent disruptions on the horizon.
In the early morning of April 12, 1980, a group of enlisted men entered the executive mansion and fought their way into the presidential quarters. President Talbot was shot and disemboweled. The man who led the assault was Samuel Doe, a 28-year-old master sergeant with an 8th grade education, leader of Liberia's first military coup.
We know that what you have done has never happened before in the history of Liberia, but it
By now, he had lost support in the army, he had lost the support of his party, and he had lost support in the streets. In the capital, there was talk of rebellion.
One could sense that unless we could break some impasse, there were violent disruptions on the horizon.
In the early morning of April 12, 1980, a group of enlisted men entered the executive mansion and fought their way into the presidential quarters. President Talbot was shot and disemboweled. The man who led the assault was Samuel Doe, a 28-year-old master sergeant with an 8th grade education, leader of Liberia's first military coup.
We know that what he have done has never happened before in the history of Liberia, but it was most necessary because of the following reasons. There has been uncontrollable corruption.
The military, which earned $80 a month under Talbot, were promised an immediate reward.
Already, we are directed that all enlisted men and men of the armed forces of Liberia and law enforcement agencies to be paid at least $250 a month.
At first, much of the country seemed jubilant. A man of the soil, it was said, would finally rule Liberia. Some even went so far as to compare Doe to an earlier savior.
Jesus Christ was born unto a poor man and in the stable among animals. David the Israelite, destroyer of Goliath, a poor shepherd boy. Head of state Samuel Doe, a master sergeant. Member of the People's Redemption Council. Member of the People's Redemption Council, sergeants and enlisted men. The analogy is drawn in history.
People came from all parts of the country to celebrate. Like the majority of the people, Doe was from one of the indigenous tribes. His supporters thought of the coup as getting rid of Americo-Liberian domination.
The so-called Americo-Liberians have come into a society that they didn't understand, and quite frankly refused to understand over the years, either out of fear or out of ignorance or just out of the sheer incapacity or inability to comprehend the dynamics of this society.
The coup leader's People's Redemption Council prepared a list of enemies of the state. It included members of the Talbot family and current and former government officials.
This is Mika Television coming to you from the Postaki, where
Talbot's cabinet was stripped, paraded in public, and humiliated. All were damned as Americo-Liberian.
Monday, April 14th.
The cabinet Talbot had, 80%. And even those so-called Americo-Liberians, all the parents were not Americo-Liberians, you see. So, but it was something that being ingrained into them, etc. And so they came up with that. And it is our time now.
The army moved swiftly to arrest and prosecute so-called enemies of the people. At the Ministry of Justice, a series of trials took place. Indigenous cabinet ministers, such as Jackson Doe, tried desperately to disassociate themselves from the fallen regime.
Officials of my background, I would like to put it that way, sat down and watched many things happen. This is why I started off by congratulating the head of state and members of the People's Redemption Council for this change.
Please tell us how many houses, lots, and or farms do you own?
Jackson Doe's life was spared, but others were not so fortunate. The trials were organized by the new Justice Minister, Che Chipo. His predecessor was his foster father, who was about to be executed. The foster father was Americo-Liberian, while Chipo was indigenous. So here, in effect, is Chipo washing his hands of his father's death.
The tribunal deemed it necessary in their judgment to have found the gravity of the crime to be equal to a death penalty. So they imposed that penalty. Then I don't know in what manner I have anything to do with it.
We would ask to have a copy of the judgment.
On the day of the executions of the 13 people, I was in my classroom in the university, and some reporter came and told me, say, you know, they're going to have some executions, but they delayed them because there are not enough polls. And that was an ominous sign of what was to come. I sort of packed my bags and went home, took a bath, and went to bed, feeling sick, very, very sick.
My father, whose family had immigrated to Liberia from Nigeria and Sierra Leone, had once been a leader of Talbot's party. When the new Doe government demanded that former officials turn themselves in, he complied and found himself sharing a cell with some of the men who had been sentenced to death.
The sun was up, everything was bright and clear, but all of a sudden, everything became dark. A storm. But we were in the cell. We did not know why. We could not account for it. But everything went bad. It really stormed. The day was dull, very, very dull. So dismal day.
In this atmosphere of random justice, my father was released. But 13 others were awaiting execution. Of those, only 4 had actually been sentenced to death, and 2 had been recommended for pardon. The bodies were dumped in a mass grave. In the days following the revolution, people chanted, "Indigenous women give birth to heroes. Americo-Liberian women give birth to thieves." At his first press conference, sitting with his mother, Doe looked less like a victorious leader than a man who had triggered events he hardly controlled. He didn't know who many of the executed ministers were, nor did he understand the complexities of the task ahead.
So can you tell us what plans you have for the country immediately?
I can't tell you that now.
So you know that. What are the main problems facing the country, do you think?
No problem.
If you were to identify one particular area of the country's economy or its justice, which would you say you will become more interested in?
Well, the Minister of